because the only way to gain forgiveness for those and to wipe the slate clean, as it were, is by getting forgiveness from the people that you've wronged. There also can be forgiveness without reconciliation. In other words, I might say to you, I forgive you, you've done whatever you can to right the wrong, but I just don't want to see you again.
That might apply with an ex-spouse.
That's right.
Or something like
exactly right. That's exactly the example I had in mind. An ex-spouse that, let's say, there were hurtful things that were done, maybe by both parties.
Maybe adultery or
maybe adultery, maybe other things.
Violence.
That's right. So the person might say, look, you've done whatever you can do in order to right the wrong. Fine. I forgive you, but I really don't want to see you again.
There's a new thing coming down the road. It's not here yet. What about genetic or electronic enhancements? Like a brain implant that allows me to use an external CPU that's 1 trillion times as fast as the one God gave me. That kind of enhancement. Or taking a gene therapy that makes me able to run a 2.5 minute mile.
Right. The issue of enhancement versus therapy, is the way that it's usually put, is very complicated. Everybody agrees, for example, that if you lose one of your natural functions, to use some kind of means to replace it is fine. Not only fine, but a good thing. So if you couldn't walk anymore because, I don't know, you were
I had my legs blown off in Iraq.
Exactly. You had your legs blown off in Iraq, and they're able somehow or another to restore your ability to walk? Absolutely yes.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Exactly. For that matter, even if it, you're not able to see very well and you use these things for enhancement, everybody says that's fine. Okay? The real issue is not therapy in the sense of restoring something that you had.
Restoring normalcy.
Restoring normal ability, but enhancement. Now we use forms of enhancement throughout our lives. We give our children education, for example.
We use binoculars.
We use binoculars. We use cars to get from one place to another, right? That enhances our ability, our mobility, right? So it's not that enhancement per se is a bad thing. The real question here is what kinds of enhancement and at what cost, and what does that do to society? In other words, again, enhancement in and of itself, it seems to me, is morally neutral. The question is, how are you using enhancement techniques, for whom, and and at what cost, and what are you doing? What are you doing with the resources that you're spending on enhancement that you would have been doing? Would you have been giving, for example, with all the resources that you're using for enhancement, would you have used those for giving basic health care to people who don't have it? If that's the case, I'd much rather give the basic health care than worry about these kinds of enhancement things. Now, the problem with that kind of reasoning, though, is that
the money to buy the enhancement is my personal property.
That's right. And the other thing is, you go this way, you would never do any research altogether, right? You would only do those things that provide basic services. So, I think the issue is a very complicated one, but the ultimate criterion is how is this enhancement being used, and at what cost?
So if in 2030, somebody comes to me and says, for $25,000, we'll stick a little wire in your head, and you'll have a little external drive that you can access the internet, and instead of having to read the Wikipedia page and absorb it the way you absorbed all those books, I will just know it the way I know how to drive home.
Right.
Okay? That it'll just be available to my mind. Okay. And that'll cost $25,000 or $50 or $100 or whatever it costs. And I say, I have the money, let's do it. What about that?
Well, I think you get into another set of complicated questions, namely, on the one hand, we live in a capitalist society, which presumes that whatever money you earn legally, you should be able to spend on whatever it is that you want to spend, except for illegal things like drugs or prostitution or hiring people to kill people or something like that, right? But
you can only do that if you're the government.
Okay, but aside from illegal activities, right? The basic principle is that you should be able to spend whatever money you have post taxes on whatever it is that you want. The other side of that is, well, what happens when these kinds of things become available? Should the government provide them for people who can't afford them? I mean, that's really what we're talking about, even in terms of basic health care, right? We have 40-some million people in America that don't have any kind of health insurance whatsoever.
And the conservative estimate is that 45,000 people died last year for lack thereof.
Yes.
Just in the United States.
Exactly right. So President Obama has tried to, President Obama has pushed through Congress, barely, a health reform act that would in fact use federal money to provide health care for the 40 million plus who don't have it now. Right? Now, the enhancement that you're talking about. So you can afford it. But what about Mr. Smith down the road who can't? Should the government provide it for him? Those kinds
Let's say
of things.
I drive a Mercedes Benz and he takes the bus.
Right.
Isn't that the same thing?
That's exactly the same thing. And so the real question becomes, what kinds of things are things that we as a community think we should provide for everybody? Things like basic health care, education, roads and bridges, that stuff. Safety, right? These kinds of things that we as a community think we should provide for everybody, as against those things which are the sort, if you can afford it, fine, if not, not. And increasingly, as it's the old Kantian question. Kant pointed out that when you cannot do something, you never have to ask whether you should. But as soon as you can do something, then you do have to ask whether you should, because there are all kinds of things that you can do that you should not do. Right? Well, in the same sort of a way, once you can create the kind of enhancement you're talking about, the real question becomes, A, should you do it? Should you spend a lot of money trying to make this enhancement? B, if once you have it, is it of the sort that those who can afford it will have it, those who can't? Or is this the kind of thing that we as a community think everybody ought to have, even if it's at government expense?
There's major problems in the world today. There's clash of civilizations, disparity of income, and what you don't hear much about in the press in the United States is that even the lowest income people in the United States are way up near the top of the income ladder in the world.
Right.
And there's 1,700,000,000 people who live more than a mile from potable water. On and on and on.
Right.
There's big problems in the world. How can we fix these problems? And what should we be doing?
Okay. My favorite rabbinic saying in all of rabbinic literature is that of Rabbeinu Tarfon, who says in Ethics of the Fathers, yours is not to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it, which I think is a recipe both for responsibility and for sanity, right? In other words, if you're going to start by saying, I need to fix the world, you're going to drive yourself insane at some point or another, or become very frustrated and in the end do nothing. So it seems to me much better to say there are immense problems in the world. I have to do something at least about some of them. I'm not going to be able to fix the world by myself. I'm going to have to try with other people to fix some pieces of this.
Fix one or two pieces.
That's right, exactly. So what that means is that I very much believe that, and in fact have acted this way in my life, that I have a duty to try to fix some of these things in ways that I have some talents in fixing. So I have, when I was in college, I was teaching 7th graders in Harlem who were reading on a 2nd grade reading level every Thursday afternoon for my first 3 years. in my last year of college, I was teaching ninth graders an enrichment. The ninth graders who, if anybody was going to go to college in that junior high school in Harlem, these were the kids. So I was doing an enrichment program for them on Fridays, right? That was the way in which I could use some of my talents to help them. Subsequently, I've been on the board of Jewish Family Service and then president of it, and we run 60-some programs in which we are doing everything from providing food for people who don't have it, and shelter, and also to drug and alcohol abuse programs, to programs for a lot of counseling programs for seniors, programs for battered women and children, and the list goes on. I'm not trained to help all of those kinds of people, so my job, in terms of being a board member of Jewish Family Service,
But you are a manager.
that's right, to get the money and for people who are trained to do those things, and to help run the organization in a way that makes sense in terms of what our mission is. Because even something like Jewish Family Service, with I think it's about a $28 million a year budget, can't do everything either.
$28 million is a drop in the bucket.
Right. So the board, one of the missions of the board is to decide what the mission of JFS is and exactly which pieces of that mission are going to, in fact, be done in any given year, and how they are going to be done. Same sort of thing with and now I'm on the board of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles. Same sort of thing. I mean, I try to help them, first of all, hone down their mission, our mission, I should say. I'm on their board, right? And then try to figure out, well, once you have a very clear mission statement, what are the particular ways in which we are going to try to accomplish this mission, right? There are people who help through Correa LA, for example, helping kids read. There are people who work at SOVA, the Jewish Family Service food pantry, in terms of distributing food and helping people get jobs through Jewish Vocational Service. There are people who...
I remember when people were coming from the Soviet Union and Jewish Vocational Service was helping them.
That's right. And so was Jewish Family Service. I mean, and that's an old Jewish pattern. I mean, I still remember my grandmother and grandfather were housing their landslide, as they put it, right? People from their old town in Europe. My grandparents had a duplex, and they basically allowed another family without rent to use the upper part of the duplex, because that's what you do when people are coming, when immigrants come, and you have to help them get off their feet. I'm sorry, get on their feet.
Do you have a particular personal spiritual practice that you could share with me?
Well, I pray every morning and most afternoons and evenings. The
Ritualized communal prayer.
Yes, the prayer of Shacharit in the morning, Mincha in the afternoon, Mariv at night. I pray those prayers, and sometimes they are just mechanical. Sometimes they are very meaningful, and sometimes they're somewhere in between. That's just the nature of prayer. Well, I do what for me is a very spiritual thing, is I do a lot of babysitting of our grandchildren. Because that is, I loved being a father. I loved raising our kids. And I took a very active role in that. They had their moments, and I'm sure I did too. But in the end, I really loved it. But being a grandparent is a whole other level of experience. And it's not because of the reasons that people not often give.
Yeah, because I can give them back.
You can give them back. Or, why do grandparents and grandchildren get along so well? Because they have a common enemy, right? It's not not that either, right? It's that you see the world through their eyes again, right?
So it's like it freshens the world up for you.
Exactly. That's what I mean. There's a spiritual experience. It really inspirits me. It enlivens me.
They look at the pattern of the wood in your floor, and it's a marvelous thing.
Right.
And you've been walking over it for 45 years and don't even notice it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's wonderful to listen to their questions and to respond to their new pieces of knowledge and things on that order. My two of my grandchildren were here this afternoon. They come regularly on Tuesday afternoons from 4 to 6, and my grandson, who's now 3 years old, is into sharks. And so
Perfect.
I now know much more about sharks than I ever knew before, and he just loves it. He just, I never did, right? And neither did any of my kids. So it's a learning experience for me. But beyond the learning experience, it's the joy that he gets out of it. It's very much what the psalmist said. Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai. How wondrous are your works, O Lord, right? And Rabu is also how many are your works, O Lord, right? So it's in the same sort of a way. There's a real sense of surprise and awe and the kinds of things that you talk about when you start talking about spiritual experiences. There's a very interesting piece of the Talmud is that a man cannot be a member of a court on a capital case, a case where capital punishment is a possibility, unless he is married and has children of his own. Because unless you have children of your own, you can't really appreciate the worth of a human being, whether that be the culprit or whether that be the victim. Because I think what the rabbis recognized was that these are really maturing experiences as well as spiritual experiences.
Well, that's also part of the rules that used to surround the study of Kabbalah.
Right.
As well. You had to be learned at 45.